So as I said, we're really thrilled to be hosting this webinar, Navigating Education Data for Internally Displaced Persons, or IDPs. This webinar builds on a series of webinars from the MIRS program called the 4 Ws of Education and Emergencies Data. Who has what data, where can I find it, and why is this so complicated? And the goal of this series is really to contribute to increased effective data usage, to further education policy, program design and implementation, and evidence building across this field. And I'm thrilled to have a few fantastic panelists and support with me today. So Annie Smiley, who is the Associate Director and Research and Evaluation at FHI 360, will be presenting along with Daniel Shepard, who is a researcher and PhD student from Teachers College, Columbia University, and a consultant with FHI 360. And we also have Tanya Smith-Streen, who is a program officer at FHI 360, and she will be helping really facilitate and coordinate this entire webinar and responding to questions in the chat and the Q&A box. So with that, I will hand it over to Annie, and just a huge thanks, and we're excited to get started.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. So excited to have you on the line. And thank you, Sonia. Thank you to INEE for making this possible. As Sonia mentioned, this is part of a series, and we're really excited to start diving into a topic that's been of interest to MIRS and to the EIE community for a long time, which is internal displacement and education, and specifically data. So I want to talk to you just a little bit about the history of how this sort of webinar that we're presenting today came to be, and this topic came to be of interest to us. As Sonia mentioned, I come from, and my colleagues Daniel and Tanya come from the USAID Middle East Education Research Training and Support Program, or MIRS, which is running from 2017 to 2021. And one component of the program, which is managed by FHI 360, focuses on EIE data. We do have a mandate to work and focus on the Middle East, but we've also looked much more globally, realizing that education and emergencies data issues are very global in scope and not specific to the region of the Middle East. So MIRS worked together with INEE and NORAG back in June 2019 to put on an INEE EIE data summit. And that data summit really honed in on the issue of IDP education data as a major gap. And out of that summit, we generated a commitment to improving the prioritization of focusing on IDP education data. Now, following the summit, a number of actions have taken place. We have an action agenda to improve the landscape for EIE education data, for education emergencies data. And then we also, at MIRS, focused this past year from January to December of 2020, the whole last year on doing a study mapping existing education data sources for IDPs and addressing challenges and opportunities associated with education data for IDPs. This was a lot of consultations, a lot of interviews with many actors in the Middle East and globally. And once we finished the analysis and the mapping and wrote the paper, we had that go through an extensive review process and through a consultative process with many of the same actors who are actually participating in the collection of IDP education data. To note, we also just in December, as through INEE and through these other actors, also launched an EIE data reference group. So if that's of interest to anyone on the line, you can reach out for more information. But there are many actors that are coming together to try to improve the education emergencies data landscape, with the IDP focus just being one. So in January 2021, that brings us to now. We actually were able to finalize the production of this education data paper for IDPs. And I'll just show you a picture of what that paper looks like, if it will come up. Oh, shoot, I'm having trouble with clicking through. There we go, it came. Just a little bit of a delay. So this paper should be actually being posted on our MIRS site. And unfortunately, I don't think it's up there as of this moment, but later today, I expect that paper will be published. So please do, I think Tanya may share a link in the chat to the site where we expect that paper to be available either later today or tomorrow. Yeah, Tanya just posted it there. Thank you, Tanya. All right, so that's how we came to where we are now. And this webinar is really the launch of the paper that you see in front of you, and also with a focus on really how to navigate and use the data that we were able to find through our mapping. I'm going to click to the next slide if the PowerPoint wants to cooperate. There we go. All right, so just really quick background before I hand over to Daniel, who's going to really help you navigate through the data sources that we found. The definition of IDP is important, and you'll see later when we talk about some of the issues and challenges that definitional issues are pretty key. So what we want to make sure everybody is on the same page on is that IDPs are defined as persons or groups of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights or natural or human-made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized state border. Of course, that last part being the key differentiator with refugees who have crossed an internationally recognized state border. Now, in 2019, there were over 50 million people around the world living as IDPs and living in conditions of internal displacement. And these large-scale displacements, as you can all imagine, have disrupted the educational trajectories of millions of children. But because displacements are internal, they're within a country, not outside of a country, there is no international agency like we have UNHCR to focus on refugees. There's no international agency, or no, I should say no one international agency that is responsible for managing services or data collection on education for internally displaced persons. So of course, as you can imagine, governments have the primary responsibility for collecting this data because it happens within a particular country. But often these governments, because they're facing fragility, because they're facing conflict, because they're facing these kinds of challenges, they are struggling to actually collect that data. There's often security issues, et cetera, and they are unable to actually collect data on education for IDPs. And there are other reasons as well why collecting data within national systems has been challenging. So of course, at the end of the day, lack of systematic education data for IDPs actually ends up exacerbating the educational challenges of IDP children because we don't have good information on these children, where they are and what kinds of services they're receiving. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Daniel.
Thank you very much, Annie. So we're just transitioning control of the PowerPoint so I can click. But in the meantime, we have a question to engage you all. We have a big group here today, and so hopefully we can keep it a bit engaging as we go through a lot of information in a fairly short period of time. So we have a question: which of these data sources have those of you on the line with us today used in your work in the past? And you can, hopefully, if it works correctly, you can select multiple. And so we'll just give you only 1 minute, a little bit less to answer this question. And we can see kind of among our audience today, and you can see among other participants, what kind of experiences with these different sources. And don't worry, this is anonymous. So. And if you don't know what they are, don't worry. We're going to talk through each of them in turn shortly. If you've used it in the past, you probably know what it is. So for the time being, don't be surprised if you see something that you're not entirely sure what it is. Okay, so hopefully we've collected a decent number of responses, and my colleague Tanya will share. So it looks like the most commonly used are the data sources from the government, which makes sense given what Annie said. The government are the primary duty bearers for both delivery and data collection around education for IDPs. But we also have quite a variety here today as far as people using different sources. Looks like number 2, most popular is the Education Cluster's Joint Education Needs Assessment. So hopefully something we say today will be new and useful to your work. So with that, we'll move forward, and Tanya, maybe you can capture that data just so we know that for future. So the first data source, starting with the government, is the EMIF, so the Educational Management Information Systems that exist across countries. This is essentially the government's administrative school data. So sample data, as many of you, as I can see from the poll, are aware, has grades, attendance, things of this nature. But because we're concerned with IDPs, then in some cases there also is information on student mobility, which could be used as a proxy for displacement. It's very rare that there's a displacement marker per se, but you can see in some scenarios where this data can be used to identify students who have been displaced, or at least a proxy of displacement, although that's not terribly common, we have to say. The frequency of the data collection, which is also a challenge when you think about education and mercies, it is usually annual, although more and more EMIFs are dynamic. So if a system is dynamic, and if it's, for example, online with unique identifiers, you could imagine tracking students as they get displaced from one school to another to ensure that you're able to provide services to them. But that is an expanding opportunity, but also one that depends on the context and the capacity. Coverage is national, albeit with areas that might not be accessible due to either conflict or natural disaster. Initiation is by the government, but with some support of international actors. And the challenges are many of what Annie shared before, which is, they're not necessarily very dynamic. And if there is a crisis, then this system might cease to operate as you would hope, and it might not operate dynamically enough to capture the changes that you need to be responsive in an EIE sort of setting. Now, as far as how to access it, if I can also, there we go. Next, we'll talk about, as far as how to access the EMIF system, it usually requires a data sharing agreement. Sorry, sometimes when I click, it takes a moment, so you'll have to do it. You'll have to bear with me. So the second government data source are registries. Now, registries could also be operated by international partners of governments. So these are usually registries affiliated with a particular classification of persons. So they might be explicitly for IDPs. They might be for people who are maybe considered victims of a crisis, as was the case of Colombia, or they might be for capturing people that are accessing a certain service provision. So the data in these registries is often quite limited as far as what's useful for educational purposes. So they might have age, right? You could identify how many students of various ages might need services in different places. They might also have student status and displacement status. The frequency depends on the system, but usually it might be just cross-sectional, so when the registration happened, so they're not necessarily dynamic. The coverage is highly variable, and the government is the primary initiator, although there's also service providers that run registries. For example, the International Organization of Migration sometimes hosts registries and so forth. Challenges are that these are very rare, and often the data are quite minimal as far as what's useful for education. Accessing both of these is a bit of a challenge unless you have a pre-existing data sharing agreement. So within government, government might be able to share between departments. If one department is collecting the registry and another is, and that's not the Ministry of Education, for example, there could be a data sharing agreement with the Ministry of Education. There could also be data sharing agreements with cluster partners in education if it's useful for their work. There are some limited open access platforms for EMIF and registries, but usually it's not the full data set. And then examples of this might include South Sudan. For EMIF, they have a relatively dynamic EMIF system for collecting at least attendance and data like this. But again, you'll have to have an agreement to access it. Syria has been expanding a dynamic EMIF system in Damascus primarily, which can capture if a student moves from one school to another, and if they're moving from an area that experienced displacement, that might serve as a proxy. And then other contexts that maybe might experience some displacement, perhaps due to a natural disaster, include the Maldives and so forth, that have dynamic EMIF systems. Registry examples include Colombia, Iraq, and Sudan. These are not exhaustive lists, but just to give you an idea of where you might look to some examples. So unfortunately, those systems are quite limited and perhaps difficult to access for some of you in the field. So we're going to go through some international organizations that also collect data that could be useful as well to your work. So the first is IDMC, so the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center. They're perhaps best known for aggregating data about the number of displaced persons in each country and globally. However, in the past years, they've also done bespoke or custom studies, including studies that look into the impacts on education. So these are usually focused studies that are non-representative, but they are collecting primary data on specific topics, including education. So they might include, for example, enrollment before and after displacement. The frequency, unfortunately, is currently non-repeated. That might change in the future. So you can't track trends over time beyond the individual study. It's quite localized, usually a specific area is focused upon for a certain reason or a certain need. It's run currently out of IDMC. And the challenges are what I said already, that it's rare and usually not representative. And of course, IDMC is still very much the go-to place for aggregate numbers. And you can look at those aggregates compared to other macro data over time, if that's of interest for those of you working on policy. Using IDMC data is accessible to all of us. So you can access the study's reports online on their website. You can access the aggregate data, including really nice data exploration tools, also on their website, so internaldisplacement.org. And as we mentioned before, we're going to share this PowerPoint and recording online, so you'll be able to click all these links and so forth. So don't feel like you have to scribble them down right now. Examples include studies in Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and Turkey, and aggregation is essentially everywhere around the globe. So now we're going to just get our hands dirty a little bit, and you can get a feel for where these data live for each of these sources. So to do that, we have a question for each of the following data sources. The first one is about Somalia. So let's see if we can find the answer to this question. If you're really quick, you can look for the second question as well. So the first question is, were boys more or less likely to be in school after displacement? And if you're quick, you can calculate the percentage difference among boys between before and after displacement. So we pasted in the link to the chat so you can click on it. You can navigate to the publications, and because they have limited time, we're going to walk you through this. And then once you're at that website with all the publications, you can search for Somalia. And hopefully you'll find a document that's titled, this is just the beginning of the document's title, Measuring the Cost of Internal Displacement. You'll see also Somalia and other countries listed in the title. And once you find that, see if you can find within the document the answer to the question. And if you can, please type it in the chat box. So once we have a few answers, potential answers, and don't worry, there's no judgment, so it's not a test. We're just trying to make sure that everyone gets a few moments to try to navigate these various web resources for data that might be useful for your work in education and emergencies. So hopefully some of you are navigating successfully to the website that's there, internaldisplacement.org/publications. Again, searching for Somalia, and then looking for the document measuring the costs. And then you'll see in that document education impacts for Somalia, and see if you can find for boys, how likely were they to be in school before and after displacement. And I'll give you a tip, there's a graph. We have 113 people, so I'm confident that one of you will find the answer. We'll just give you about 30 seconds more. Beautiful, I see 2 answers there, back to back. A couple other people chiming in. Excellent, excellent. So yes, that's right. So there were 29% were in school before displacement, 41% after displacement, for a 12 percentage point increase. And you'll see that the trend is also different for boys and girls. So girls were more in school before and less in school after. So this again shows that we need data. The story is not always clear and straightforward, and it'll help us in our work in knowing where we need to target resources for education, programming, and policy. So thanks very much for those of you that engage in that exercise. And you'll see that it's not the easiest to navigate some of these websites. They're kind of the classic repositories of documents. So that's one of the themes you'll see in this webinar. So the next data source that we're going to look at together is IOM, so the International Organization of Migration, DTM, Displacement Tracking Matrix, multi-sector location assessment. So unfortunately in international work and EIE, we are plagued by acronyms. So there are a lot of acronyms in this presentation. So this is a key informant-based, local area-based estimate of sectoral indicators, including education. So they speak to key informants in various, say, villages or other geographic areas, and they ask those key informants for estimates of the number out of school, the distance to school, how easy it is to walk to school, differentiating perhaps between primary, secondary, but it's not a household survey of families. The frequency is annually, although in theory it could be done more regularly because, as many of you are probably aware, the DTM has other data collection mechanisms that are more frequent. The coverage is usually national, although there's always some areas that are perhaps excluded depending on the context, and some areas that might have more frequency, again, depending on context. The initiation is really, they're moving more and more towards making sure that these are being initiated in collaboration with and by the cluster system and by the humanitarian system. So having spoken to some folks at IOM DTM, I know that they're keen to have engagement with education cluster folks to understand what the needs are, and they have very useful resources for conducting these sorts of data collection exercises as well, for those of you interested. The challenge, among others, with this data source is that it relies on estimation of key informants, and those key informants may not be educational experts. So it depends who's accessible, who's kind of in the list of key informants, and especially if the data collectors have limited time in the field, they might not be able to speak to someone, for example, from the district education office. They might have to speak to someone that's from a different sector that has a general sense of the educational situation. So using the DIOM DTM MSLA, you'll navigate to their website. It's similar to what we just did. They have a report section. In that report section, if you're looking for these multi-sector location assessments, they're not always named the same way. So you'll need to look for location assessment, village assessment, site assessment, and sometimes they might be in other languages, French, Spanish, which you'll also want to look if you work in an area that speaks another language and publishes in other languages. So this is not the easiest data necessarily to navigate. There are many countries that have these data, so this list is not complete here, but this gives you an idea. It's perhaps the most, has the highest coverage in terms of countries. So it's really an interesting data resource. If you're not yet using it, it's worth seeing if it's available for some years for your context. So again, we'll do a very short exercise to see if we can answer a quick question using the multi-sector location assessment from IOM DTM. So Tanya just posted in the chat the link, and we're going to try to find an answer to this question. So in Iraq in 2019, what percentage of locations, again, it's a location assessment, had less than 75% of IDP children attending primary school? So the answer to this is the percent of locations that have low attendance in primary school, essentially, or below what we would like. To help you navigate, you go to dtm.iom.int/report. You'll want to search, in this case, you'll search for location assessments. And to, again, help you along the way, you'll be looking for the Iraq Integrated Location Assessment Part 4, June 2019, so because we're looking for the data from the more recent exercise from 2019. So let's see if some of you on the call can find this data, find this report, and see if you can answer the question as far as the percent of locations that had less than 75% of IDP children attending primary school. And the link is in the chat. So I see some answers already coming in. I won't say yet if they're correct, to keep the suspense. About 20 more seconds. So very well found, the new study. Thank you very much. It is indeed 28% of locations had IDPs, less than 75% of IDP children attending school. And you'll see that that differs by a large amount compared to returnees, which we also have data on, so 11% of locations for returnees. So again, these data can be helpful for thinking about how we're providing services and where we're providing services, both for IDPs and for those that are returning back and trying to resettle. So now we'll move on to the next resource. So the next resource that we'll speak about today is REACH's multi-sector needs assessment. So it's almost the same name, but has needs instead of location. And this is a household level data collection on the needs of populations of concern. So in countries where IDPs are a population of concern, which is many of the countries in which many of you work, there will be a flag within the data for IDPs. And then in the reports, they might report that data separately. In some cases, you might need to request access to the data to be able to pull out certain subgroups and populations of concern. Example data from the MSNA, again, this is household level usually, although not always, includes school enrollment, intent to move. So you might want to know there's this many people in this area now, but how many of them are going to move in the next month or 2 months, which obviously affects your planning and programming. And barriers to school attendance, right? Because it's a needs assessment. So they also have interesting data on what are the barriers, including for different groups. So that's just a sample of the data. There's more data than that in the MSNAs. And they have other sectoral data as well, if that's of interest to you. For frequency, these are annual. They're usually informing the humanitarian needs overviews and also the HRPs, the Humanitarian Response Plans. They're not always done every year, though. You'll see that under the challenge. The coverage is usually the crisis-affected areas, so not necessarily national. And this is initiated by the humanitarian system, humanitarian country team, OCHA, cluster, and so forth. And there's often I would say almost always, very close collaboration between the cluster and REACH on conducting these needs assessments. The challenge is that although they are annual in theory, they're not every year. So if you're looking for a trend, you might not be able to piece together the trend using this data yet, and perhaps that'll improve over time. As far as how to access and use the data from MSNAs by REACH, they have, again, a reports website. So www.reachresourcecenter.info/theme/multi-sector assessment. And examples of countries that are covered are listed here. I won't read them to you. But while the other data that we're looking at is primarily reports, the REACH MSNA also sometimes posts the data. So you can download an Excel sheet with data. I see a question about how the answer was found. And perhaps what we could do is whenever we post this resource, we might post some answer to questions like this that require some more details for those of you that have some difficulty finding it. I know 1 minute is not a lot of time to navigate some of these websites. So the REACH MSNA is available at the REACH Resource Center and has a number of countries that are covered. When you navigate to the REACH Resource Center, which we'll do in this example, to answer the following question, you'll see that they have the data in order of the most recent to the least recent. So if you're looking for something old, you'll have to scroll down. So the question that we're going to try to engage with, to just get a feel for the website, it's okay if you don't find the answer. It's more to just see where you might look for these answers. So in Syria in 2014/2015, I think both because some parts of the report are not clear about the timeline. How many villages in Aleppo out of 13 assessed had no functioning schools? So again, you'll navigate to the REACH Resource Center, which is there in your chat and also here on your screen. There's a theme sort of filter where you can actually select multi-sector assessment. So that's very helpful. And then you'll want to look for Syria in 2014. And here we put the full name of the document for you. And it's a bit tricky with the first time you do this because you'll have to click publications and sometimes it'll pop you back up to the top of the website. So when you click publications on Syria 2014 multi-sector needs assessment, you might get knocked to the top of the website. So you just need to scroll back down until you'll see an expanded view of that line, which will include the PDF, which then you can click on. So this might not happen with every browser, but it does happen with some browsers. So I'll give you guys, again, a minute, and it's okay if you don't find the answer, but it's just to engage with the website and get a feel for how you might find something and what else is available on this website and through this resource. Again, you'll navigate to reachresourcecenter.info. You'll look for the multi-sectoral assessment theme. You'll look for Syria in 2014, and because it's in most recent, it's in order from most recent to least recent, you'll be looking down on the page further, and then you'll click on publications, and then click on the PDF, and see if you can find the section on education, right? So there's another hint. And see if you can find the number of villages in the Aleppo Governorate out of the 13 that had no functioning schools when this particular assessment was carried out. I'll give another hint. It's on page 3. Perhaps if you can type into the chat, have any of you been able to find the PDF? So maybe you didn't find the data, but I just want to know if some of you have been able to find the PDF. Okay, so we have some difficulties with navigating the site. So it looks like sometimes it's a bit slow, sometimes the PDF is not pulling up open. So we'll move on from that, but the answer is 8 out of the 13 villages. And you'll see that a common theme across these is that there's often more data than some folks are aware of, but it's not always easy to navigate the repositories and the reports to find the data that we're looking for. And as we know now during COVID, everyone's online and sometimes it's a bit slow. So with that, the answer was 8 out of 13 on page 3, and hopefully you'll be able to navigate back to that website and try searching for data that you find useful for your work later. And as I said, we'll post some instructions and perhaps some screenshots on the page afterwards to help you guys navigate these resources. So the next source that we're going to talk about is the Genus. So I think that's the second most commonly used of our audience today. So this is a joint education needs assessment, which is coordinated by the education cluster. So it's a collaborative needs assessment that is done through the efforts of multiple members of the education cluster. And the data might include access, school closure information, teacher training, facilities, materials. By and large, the data in the GENA is much more rich than the data on the other sources because it's dedicated only to educational needs. So it has more questions that are covering more topics than you might find on the multi-sector resources, because multi-sector resources are also covering all the other sectors. And so they have limited education data. So there's a lot of data that are available when these do occur, but you'll see that under frequency, they're quite irregular, although they're increasing in number. Coverage is usually local and focused more on the areas where the various members of the cluster are operating. And as I'm speaking, I'll try to speak slowly. I apologize if I go quickly. I see a comment there from someone. But also we'll have the recording posted. with closed captioning. So hopefully that will help for those that want to look back at some of the details later. But duly noted. Coverage is usually where the various partners of the cluster are operating. And the initiation is often by the cluster leads, perhaps by donors, depends somewhat on the context. But I have to say that speaking to various folks, it does not seem that funding is usually the biggest barrier to doing Genus. Usually there's perhaps under prioritization and other barriers, lack of capacity perhaps. So often there's the possibility to do a Genus. So definitely reach out to the cluster if you're a member of the education cluster and want to do a Genus. Challenge is that they're not very regular and they're often not representative, although there's guidance on how to do them in a representative manner. So using the education cluster Genus, you can access these. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find these directly on the cluster website, although your cluster might have a good kind of country-based platform where you can find this for your country. So what we recommend is to navigate to humanitarianresponse.info to find the Genus and look under the documents at humanitarianresponse.info. And that's probably your best bet for finding these reports. So you'd want to look for either Genus or Joint Education Needs Assessment. And here we've listed some of the countries that have done Joint Education Needs Assessments. So now we'll try applying again, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more luck finding these resources via Humanitarian Response and stuff. So we're going to try to answer this question by navigating to the following website, which Tanya has pasted into the chat. So humanitarianresponse.info / so they have multiple languages, but we'll say English here for the purposes of our webinar. Documents. And then look for Nigeria, because the question we're going to try to answer together is, in Nigeria in 2019, what percentage of schools had sufficient learning materials in Borno State? So you'll notice from the question itself, the data are more specific than what you might be able to answer with data from the MSLA or the MSNA. So once you navigate to the documents at Humanitarian Response, you might search for example, Nigeria Genus, the document search field, which is at the top left. And you'll see a document that pop up, should be probably at the top of your search list. Nigeria Joint Education Needs Assessment Report, 30th November 2019. There's a little screenshot in the bottom corner of the screen that shows you what it might look like. And then there'll be a little red button in the bottom right-hand corner that says download, and that's how you look at the PDF. And so then once you get the PDF open, you might look for, search for Control F in the PDF, for example, and search for learning materials. And you'll see, you might be able to find the answer to this and enter it into the chat. So in 2019, in Nigeria, in Borno State, so quite specific, what percentage of schools had sufficient learning materials? So I see one answer. We're having a little bit better luck this time than the previous resource. We'll see if some other answers come in, and we'll see which one's right. Okay, excellent. So we've had better luck this time around. Yes, indeed, 14% in Borno. So 86% did not have sufficient learning materials. And you'll see in that same area, there's data on other areas. So you have Borno, 14%, Adamawa, 10%, and so forth. And you'll have to excuse my pronunciation if it's not correct. So the next resource that we'll talk about, and this is the last one, is the Joint IDP Profiling Service, or JIPS. And it's a data service that designs and coordinates data collection exercises, often in urban areas, but in other areas as well, specifically focused on IDPs. And they're usually doing household level data. So it's quite a rigorous data collection exercise with quite precise data that goes down to the household level. Available data might be, what education services are there? Is there a formal school, non-formal school? Who's it provided by, and so forth? Number of teachers, what's the training of the teachers? So sometimes the data for this is quite specific, depending on the needs of the partners. Unfortunately, the resource is quite irregular as far as the number of countries covered and the frequency with which they're covered. The coverage is usually local, so it's often urban areas or specific areas that, say, the government and local partners have prioritized. Initiation is by government and partners, asking JIPS for support to coordinate this sort of data collection. So JIPS kind of facilitates it and builds capacity to do it, but others are engaged in actually carrying it out. The challenge is that there's limited coverage and limited repetition. So using JIPS, again, it's a bit of a challenge because there are different websites. So you could navigate to the JIPS website and find reports. You might also find reports in other locations, but they also have a quite nice data exploration tool for a number of their studies called DART. So you'll see the link there, dart.jips.org. And we'll maybe skip the question because I think we're running low on time. But you can navigate to that data exploration tool, and you'll see that if you do that, and maybe Tanya can just post the link so that you can get a feel for what it looks like, you can click analysis and graphs and tables at the top right, and then you can pick a certain country or context. So in this example, we were going to do Côte d'Ivoire, but you could pick some of the others. And so you pick a data set, and then you pick the indicators, and then you can pick the disaggregation. So in here, you could have selected Côte d'Ivoire and looked at education, so number of household members attending school, and looked at disaggregation for those under 18 years old and seeing the number in the data set that were not in school, for example. So in this case, it was 36% is the answer, and 39% if you use, 39% if you calculate it directly, and 36% if you use some of their conversions that they use. So I know that was quick, but we're running low on time, and Annie has a few other slides to share with you about some of the challenges facing the field. So you can play around with the website later. And lastly, before I turn it over to Annie, there's a number of useful guidance documents by JIPS, by the cluster, by DTM, on how to do data collection and what the challenges are around data collection with IDPs and with education and emergencies more broadly. So these are useful resources for those of you that are not aware of them. They're highly recommended, and you'll find links to this when we upload the document. So with that, I'll turn it over to Annie to talk about some of the challenges that still face the field.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for that really comprehensive overview. And we're sorry, everybody, that we're running a little bit behind, but I'm glad that we took a little bit of time for those exercises. I think it's really useful. So we want to talk really quickly about what we learned from this analysis of, talking to actors across the field who are doing this kind of work. What are the issues and challenges? What are the factors that hinder and help IDP education data collection? And we're going to launch a poll, but in just a second, and just before we do that, just to outline that we're talking about conceptual factors, about definitions and how we think about definitions for IDPs, how that's operationalized, as well as technical and methodological factors, which focus on how data are collected. There are institutional factors, which really focus on how systems are structured, and then also political factors, which focuses on competition for power or status. And we do see challenges across all of these different types of factors. So if we could launch the poll, we're going to ask everybody to select the top three challenges, the things that you think most strongly hinder or make IDP education data collection challenging. So go ahead and select 3. I'll give you a couple minutes to read through this. Tanya, you ready to show the results? Okay. Tanya's going to pull up the results on the screen. Okay, so we're going to talk through briefly most of these challenges, but we see what everyone thinks the top challenge is that national education data systems, so EMIF and registries and other national systems, are often not dynamic or resilient enough to capture IDPs. And that I would agree with that personally. I think that is probably the top challenge that we're facing in this sector. Some other key challenges, let's see what else we have here. The lack of a good sampling frame for IDP context because we have unstable populations is another big one. The last one on the list there is that areas with many IDPs may also have poor security and limited access for data collection. Clearly, that's going to be a challenge. So thank you so much for taking that. And now we'll jump into what we found in our research. Trying to click to the next slide. There we go. So we didn't really prioritize which ones were the top challenges, but just quickly go through these. We did find that although the international community has a common normative definition, like as we shared at the beginning, we know what we mean by IDP, we don't have a common operational definition. And that may sound confusing, but when you start to think about it, it's not really clear what we mean by IDP on 3 dimensions. So it's important to think about location, reason, and timing when we're talking about the definition for an IDP in an operational sense. So we know that the location means that there's an internal move within a country, but we don't know what distance is sufficient to be counted as an IDP. And so that can obviously make a difference when we're talking about data. In terms of reasons, we know that the reason needs to be forced, not volitional, but what type of force is considered sufficient for the move to be considered to fall into this category of force. So again, it's a definitional issue. And then finally, timing. When we're talking about the normative similarity, we say that the timing needs to be that it's a recent and temporary move with the intention of the person to return or move again. I think we can all see the challenge there when we think about long-term IDP contexts that we've all seen globally. And so we don't have a cutoff date for displacement status. And that has also been a challenge. So you can see why all of these things would be very contextual based on the specific context, and that makes it hard to have a global normative, global operational definition. Now, in terms of technical and methodological factors, some of the key issues that rose to the top were the geographic precision of our data collection instruments would affect how we identify IDPs. And again, that gets to, how far does somebody have to move for them to be considered an IDP, for example? And then do we have data with that level of geographic precision? Is it moving between local government authorities or districts, or can it be within a district? Or what's sort of the granularity of the data that we have to demonstrate that move? We also have issues around different methods of determining IDP status, which results in very different data. So this is, again, this issue of definitional issues and contextual data that looks different across contexts and makes it difficult for us to have a common method. We also have issues where data collectors, as mentioned in the poll earlier, might lack a sampling frame, which prevents the collection of representative data on educational indicators for IDPs. How do you have a sampling frame when populations are on the move and you don't actually know who's in your population on any given day because of that movement? So those are some of the key methodological factors that we learned about in the research. We have a couple slides on institutional factors, which turned out to be pretty key. Now, the key one that everyone already mentioned is that national education data systems are often not dynamic or resilient enough to capture IDPs. And then when EMIF is more dynamic, we're better able to capture this population. And we do have examples of that we present in the paper. So it's definitely worth looking in and seeing where this is being done with a little bit more dynamism globally. And then some international institutional factors. Again, as we mentioned at the beginning, there isn't clarity in the international community about which organization has primary responsibility. And I saw there was some discussion about this in the chat as well. And I think that, that one of the challenges is that a national government should have primary responsibility for IDPs. And so it's not, there isn't a clear global mandate, but there are other issues as well when it comes to that lack of clarity. And then standard data collection procedures and guidance, or the lack thereof globally, can affect the quality, utility, and efficiency of IDP education data. Oops, I might have just clicked the slide again. Okay. So the second focus on institutional factors is looking at this intersection actually between national and international organizations and groups. And what we've seen is a helping factor is that new transitional educational sector planning tools can really help facilitate linkages between international and national institutions. So trying to build that sort of coherence across international and national data sets to make use of IDP education data to inform national planning. So there are some good examples of where that's starting to happen. And then we've got the issue of the motivation and profile of these of national and international staff, as well as their capacity, can affect data collection and quality. All right, so we're going to move on to one more type of factor, which is political. People mention this, but security may be a huge challenge, and we may have actually parts of a country that are subject to the control or under the control of different parties, which can make access difficult. Now, this is super important. Identifying IDPs in any data set may actually put them at risk, since education can be used as a tool in a conflict. So we have to really consider do no harm when we're thinking about identifying IDPs, just the same as we do with refugees in our data sets. Also, intergroup politics can affect the ethics and utility of our IDP-specific education data collection and use. And then the last bullet there is that interorganizational politics can also influence what we see as a fragmentation of the IDP education data landscape. And what we want to do is obviously pull that together and stop any fragmentation that's beginning to happen, because a lot more actors are starting to get involved, which is a good thing. And so trying to find ways to make sure that fragmentation doesn't take place. One more slide, and then I think we'll start the Q&A, which is going to be very brief. And so the last slide here is on our key takeaways. Really, at the end of the day, thank you so much, Daniel, for sharing all these data sources. There are some great data sources on education for IDPs. I'm sure that not all of you were aware of all of these data sources, so I hope that you'll have more access. Now that you know that they're out there, there is a lot of room for improvement. And I think one of the biggest challenges that Daniel mentioned a couple times is that, a lot of these are just repositories of reports, and they're difficult to navigate. And so how do we actually make this data more accessible and easier to navigate? That's a challenge that we can really consider globally. Now, we do have new initiatives on improving this landscape, and INEE's EIE Data Reference Group is one example. UNESCO also has a group focusing on EMIF in emergencies and really trying to strengthen those national education data systems in emergency contexts. There are other initiatives as well, and there is significant potential for improving this landscape. So stay tuned, and INEE will be keeping you updated on these issues and challenges as we move through them. So I'm going to hand over to Tanya to handle a really brief Q&A.
Thanks so much, Annie. And thank you both, Daniel and Annie, for those great presentations and really applied activities. I think that went over really well, and we'll have time to provide more resources and guidance on how to access those different data sources following the webinar, in addition to some recordings. So as Annie mentioned, we'll have a brief time for Q&A. I saw that we had several questions come in through the Q&A box during our discussion. And Elizabeth, I saw you were able to field a few of those. So I think it would actually be helpful to get both Daniel and Annie's perspective, in addition to Elizabeth's, on some of these questions. So we did have a back and forth between Atiku or Raman on this question that we were discussing in the last section around factors that may hinder IDP data collection. So it really touched on why the mandate around IDP data collection and why are agencies not taking data collection on IDPs into consideration to inform effective humanitarian response. So Elizabeth talked about that mandate and then said that it really depends on the country. There are some countries and contexts where the international community is playing a larger role in collaborating with governments, but again, depends on that national mandate. So I wonder whether, Daniel, with your work on the report, if you could delve a little bit deeper into this question about why there's no agency responsible for managing data on IDPs, given this is such a big global challenge.
So I think folks have touched on it a little bit, both through our presentation, also through some of the comments that were made in the chat and then the questions, that it is the primary responsibility of the national authorities to take care of education and collect data within their country. So I think that's one factor that makes it country specific and makes it difficult perhaps to have one international agency that's working cross countries. But I think that there really is an opportunity, even though we're very aware of the challenge that this will face. There's an opportunity to have a clear facilitator at the international level that everyone knows, like, this is the go-to facilitator that can connect me to all the other organizations that are doing great work. Because we don't want to take away from the specialized, skills and services that are provided. But it's our opinion, having done this research, that it would be useful to have that kind of point person or point entity. And there's some organizational politics around who that should be. So hopefully, these mechanisms that have been created in the past years will help people discuss who should be in charge of that, and help us move towards less fragmentation. I hope that's somewhat helpful. You'll find more discussion of this in the report as well.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Daniel. And we have another minute left, so maybe we can just take on one more question from Suha Tutunuji. How do you tackle the problem of data being updated and corrected as quite a few of the IDPs change their dwellings or are relocated? And I know this is a challenge we discussed significantly in the paper. So maybe Daniel, you could take that one on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the frequency of data collection matters a lot, right? Because if people are moving quite frequently, then you'll need the data quite frequently. And that's why also I think asking questions around when people plan to move next is extremely useful for policy and programming.
Great. Yeah,
so
and
unfortunately, we don't yet have a frequent enough source, so it is a challenge. But I think if you can ask, how frequently people move, you might get a sense for how stable the data is.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, and I know that this is something that links to some of the other research that MIRS has done, and that can be accessed on the landing page that we shared earlier during today's webinar, where we have our data use framework and other factors that go into when data is collected, who it's collected by, et cetera. So with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Sonia to conclude the webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tanya, and thanks, Annie and Daniel, for fantastic presentations. Yeah, just to wrap up, we are excited to take this discussion forward. Please keep an eye out for an email with the recordings, the presentation, and as well the launch of the paper. I think it'll be a really great resource for our sector. And feel free to follow up with any questions as well. We're happy to make those connections and direct your questions to the relevant folks. So just a huge thanks for joining us today. I hope you all have a fantastic morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.